The real question is whether positivity is being used in a way that supports people or whether it sometimes becomes a way of avoiding difficult emotions, uncomfortable conversations, and maybe even important realities. So, see, toxic positivity has gained attention because people are increasingly recognizing a gap between what they are feeling and what they believe they are expected to feel. One of the biggest misconceptions is that acknowledging difficult emotion is somehow the opposite of resilience. In reality, emotional awareness and resilience are closely connected. You can't effectively navigate emotions that you are unwilling to acknowledge. When people compare their internal experiences with carefully curated external reality, they often conclude that they are the only ones struggling. Ironically, someone can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone.
So perhaps the biggest risk isn't difficult emotions themselves, it's when people no longer feel comfortable acknowledging them.
Many well-being challenges become more difficult because conversations happen too late. Stress becomes burnout, pressure becomes exhaustion, isolation becomes distress. One of the most effective forms of prevention is normalizing early conversation.
Today's conversation reminds us that toxic positivity isn't about positivity itself. It's about what happens when positivity leaves no room for authentic human experiences. Real well being is not creating an ignored difficult emotions. It's created by acknowledging them, understanding them, and responding to them with empathy, honesty, and support. And when
If there is one thought that I would like to leave all of you with, is this. The next time when someone shares a difficult experience, try listening before fixing. Understanding before advising and curiosity before judgment are extremely important.
Welcome to Beyond the Narrative, where mental health myths, trends, and truths collide. I'm Kiran Khullar, a cognitive hypnotic psychotherapist, and in this series, we explore some of the most debated, misunderstood, and widely accepted ideas in mental health. Together, we'll question assumptions, examine popular beliefs, and have evidence informed conversations about the narratives shaping how we understand wellness, resilience, therapy, and human behavior. Because not everything we hear about mental health is entirely true, entirely false, or as simple as it seems. In today's episode, we'll discuss a topic that has become increasingly common across social media, workplace, educational institutes, and everyday conversations: toxic positivity. When just stay positive does more harm than good. To help us unpack this important conversation, I'm joined by Nitin Shah, CEO of ICHARS and Director of ICHARS Support Foundation. Nitin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kiran. I'm glad that we are having this conversation because toxic positivity is often misunderstood. In fact, positivity itself is often misunderstood. Many people assume the discussion is about whether optimism or positivity are harmful. That's not really the issue. The real question is whether positivity is being used in a way that supports people or whether it sometimes becomes a way of avoiding difficult emotions, uncomfortable conversations, and maybe even important realities. So, while positivity can be valuable, the challenge begins when positivity becomes more important than understanding itself.
That's an important distinction because the conversation isn't really about choosing between positivity and negativity. It's about understanding where encouragement becomes emotional invalidation and where optimism starts replacing emotional honesty. So let's begin here. Why do you think toxic positivity has become such a widely discussed topic in recent years?
Primarily because of what you mentioned right now, that encouragement is now for many people turning into emotional invalidation, and optimism is beginning to replace, I think the word you used was emotional honesty, right? So, see, toxic positivity has gained attention because people are increasingly recognizing a gap between what they are feeling and what they believe they are expected to feel. Over the last decade, mental health awareness has grown significantly. People are more willing to talk about stress, burnout, anxiety, grief, and emotional struggles. What they are doing about it is a different conversation for a different time, and we'll probably get there at some point. But at the same time, we have seen an explosion of motivational content, self improvement messaging, and positivity focused narrative. Individually, both developments can be helpful. The challenge emerges when difficult emotions are treated as problems to overcome immediately rather than experiences to understand. Someone dealing with academic pressure, workplace stress, uncertainty, or loss may not always need motivation first. They may need understanding first. Yet many people receive messages such as don't overthink, focus on the positive, everything happens for a reason, every cloud has a silver lining. And there are like a series of such quotations, conversations, phrases that we have heard in our life, right? While these responses often come from a place of care, they can sometimes leave people feeling unheard, make people feel as if their emotions are not important or are being invalidated.
So the issue isn't positivity itself. It's what happens when positivity becomes the expected response to every difficult situation, right?
That would be correct. One of the biggest misconceptions is that acknowledging difficult emotion is somehow the opposite of resilience. In reality, emotional awareness and resilience are closely connected. You can't effectively navigate emotions that you are unwilling to acknowledge. For example, encouragement can be helpful for a student facing academic pressure. But if encouragement comes before understanding, the student may feel dismissed. The same is true for an employee experiencing significant stress. Before people can move forward, they often need to feel heard. The problem isn't difficult emotions. The problem is believing those emotions shouldn't exist in the first place.
It seems those expectations are often reinforced by the environments people live in.
Very much so. Many of us grow up learning how to celebrate success, but not how to respond to disappointment, uncertainty, rejection, or failure. As a result, difficult emotions are often viewed as obstacles rather than natural parts of being human. Social media has amplified this dynamic. People are constantly exposed to stories of achievement, productivity, happiness, and personal growth. While those stories can be inspiring, they can also create an impression that everyone else is coping perfectly, and many a times everyone else doesn't even need to cope because they're living perfect, right? When people compare their internal experiences with carefully curated external reality, they often conclude that they are the only ones struggling. And over time, that pressure becomes internal. People begin believing that they should always be optimistic, productive, grateful, and resilient. When the inevitability happen, when they experience stress, frustration, self doubt, or emotional exhaustion, they judge themselves rather than understand themselves. And that's why this conversation remains relevant. People may be more willing to talk about mental health today, but many are still uncomfortable with emotional discomfort itself. And that's where the gap continues to exist.
And if that gap continues to grow, it raises another important question. How does toxic positivity affect the way people recognize distress, and what warning signs are we often missing?
So, one of the biggest challenges is that emotional distress doesn't always look the way people expect. When we imagine someone struggling, we often picture obvious signs: sadness, withdrawal, visible frustration, or emotional breakdown. But many people continue functioning well while privately feeling overwhelmed. They attend classes, they meet deadlines, they fulfill responsibilities. From the outside, everything appears normal. Internally, however, they may be carrying significant emotional strain. That's why one of the most overlooked warning signs is emotional disconnection. And I'm sure you have experienced this, right? You have been through situations where internally you were feeling very uncomfortable, but externally, people looked at you and they thought, oh, you're doing so well in your life.
So, this usually does happen with women. They just carry on with their everyday works. And what does this emotional discontent actually look like in practice?
Okay, so before I get to your question, so when you mentioned this happens with women, this actually also happens with a lot of men, right? But the point is that at times, functionality does not clearly and effectively define emotional challenges that people are experiencing,
Right.
right? Now, to come to your question, what does emotional disconnection look like? Okay, so it often begins when people stop paying attention to what they are experiencing. Instead of asking, what is making me stressed? What is making me exhausted? They immediately try to push those feelings aside. Over time, emotions become something to suppress rather than understand. For example, a student facing ongoing academic pressures may continue performing well, but gradually lose motivation, confidence, or enthusiasm. Similarly, an employee may remain productive while feeling increasingly detached, exhausted, or emotionally drained. The struggle becomes less about original challenge and more about carrying that challenge alone. And sometimes even certain therapeutic modalities, tools reinforce this idea. When we tell people that when you have a negative thought, you can restructure your thought, you can remember something positive. What we are still doing is not helping people address the situation or the challenge, but we are helping them cope up with the challenge. And while coping up is important in the long run, it's not a very reliable strategy.
And I can imagine that can affect more than just emotional well being.
Absolutely. One of the most common consequences is isolation. When people don't feel comfortable discussing challenges honestly, conversations can become increasingly superficial. Others assume everything is fine because that's all they see, while the individuals feel less understood and less supported. Ironically, someone can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. Another important consequence is delayed help seeking. People often convince themselves that their struggles aren't serious enough to discuss. They tell themselves, I'll get over it. I shouldn't complain. Other people have bigger problems. I just need to stay positive. As a result, support is often sought much later than it could have been. And if you notice, these are the same sentences that we spoke about earlier, where people say this to us out of care. The problem is that at times stops us from seeking help when we should seek one.
So that seems particularly relevant for educators, managers, and leaders.
It is relevant for everyone. Many warning signs are easy to misinterpret. A student may appear disengaged when they are actually overwhelmed. An employee may feel less motivated when they are experiencing burnout. A team may appear resistant when they are struggling with uncertainty or stress. The visible behavior gets attention, the underlying experience often does not. And that's why these challenges can remain hidden for a long period of time.
So perhaps the biggest risk isn't difficult emotions themselves, it's when people no longer feel comfortable acknowledging them.
Yes, because once emotional honesty disappears, support becomes much harder to access. If I don't even acknowledge that I have a particular emotional challenge, why would I seek help? And that's why the next part of the conversation becomes so important.
And how do we create environments where people feel safe enough to be honest in the first place? If toxic positivity makes emotional struggles harder to recognize and discuss, what can schools, workplace leaders, and communities do differently?
The first step is creating environments where emotional honesty is viewed as a strength rather than a weakness. Many people associate resilience with pushing through difficulty, but genuine resilience begins with acknowledging reality. You can't effectively address a challenge that you're unwilling to recognize, like I mentioned earlier. Whether we are talking about students, employees, leaders, community members, people are more likely to seek support when they feel safe being honest about what they're experiencing.
That requires a different approach to support.
It does. Support isn't always about providing immediate solutions. Often it's about creating a space for understanding first. For educators, that may mean creating classrooms where students feel comfortable discussing setbacks and challenges. For managers, it may mean listening before offering reassurance. For leaders, it may mean modeling healthy conversations about stress, uncertainty, and well being. People are more likely to speak honestly when they believe honesty will be met with understanding rather than correction.
And I can imagine that has important implications for preventions as well.
It does. Many well being challenges become more difficult because conversations happen too late. Stress becomes burnout, pressure becomes exhaustion, isolation becomes distress. One of the most effective forms of prevention is normalizing early conversation. When people feel comfortable discussing concerns early, support becomes easier, more effective, and often less intense. Support doesn't always require formal interventions. Sometimes it begins with reflection, conversation, or with reaching out with people before difficulties escalate.
That requires changing how people think about seeking help.
A healthier approach is viewing support seeking as a part of well being rather than a response to crisis. Just as we don't want to wait for a major health issue before paying attention to physical well being, emotional well being should also be approached proactively. When people understand that seeking support is a normal part of functioning, not a sign of weakness, stigma begins to reduce naturally.
And beyond individuals, what roles do institutes and communities play?
I feel a critical one. Workplaces can strengthen psychological safety by creating cultures where people feel comfortable raising concerns and asking for support. Educational institutions can normalize conversations about well being and train educators to recognize early warning signs. Communities can foster stronger networks of connection and belongingness. The goal isn't to eliminate discomfort from life, that's neither realistic nor necessary. The goal is to create an environment where people can navigate challenges honestly, constructively, and with appropriate support. When emotional safety, psychological safety, and accessible support systems come together, people are less likely to struggle in silence. And I'm happy to see that there are more and more organizations, schools, colleges, communities beginning to do that. At ICHARS Support Foundation, we ourselves in the last couple of months have worked with a couple of these organizations for schools, colleges. We have actually had training programs for teachers so that they can manage their emotional health, their mental health better, and also so that they can learn to recognize signs, symptoms in children and provide them with support that is useful for them.
Perhaps that's where sustainable change really begins, not with a single initiative, but with constant cultural change.
I think that's an important takeaway from today's discussion that the emotional well being doesn't require us to choose between positivity and honesty, right? And it does require consistent effort. Hope matters, optimism matters, resilience matters. But they are most effective when they are grounded in reality rather than used to avoid reality. Like I mentioned earlier, the goal isn't to eliminate difficult emotions. The goal is to create environments where people can acknowledge them, understand them, and respond to them in healthy ways.
That points to something larger than individual responsibility.
There's still a very high degree of individual responsibility. But yeah, if there is more support available from your environment, from your peers, it obviously helps. So, whether we are educators, managers, leaders, parents, mental health professionals, volunteers, or even community members, we all influence the environment around us. Creating healthier conversations about emotional well being would require collective effort. This doesn't take away the responsibility of the person who's struggling themselves, right? But obviously, if there's support available around them, things can become a lot more easier for them. So, awareness is important, but awareness alone is not enough. We also need stronger support system, better mental health literacy, greater accessibility, and continued investment in evidence informed approaches. People should have access to support that is ethical, effective, affordable, and most importantly, delivered by a competent professional. And that requires collaboration. Schools, colleges, workplaces, NGOs, community organizations, and mental health professionals all have a role to play. Meaningful progress happens when different parts of the ecosystem work together towards a shared goal.
And that's where organizations working across education, community well being, and mental health can make an important contribution.
Exactly. The objective isn't simply increasing conversations about mental health. The objective is ensuring that those conversations lead to greater understanding, healthier help seeking behavior, stronger support systems, and better outcomes for individuals and communities.
I think that's a meaningful note to conclude on. Today's conversation reminds us that toxic positivity isn't about positivity itself. It's about what happens when positivity leaves no room for authentic human experiences. Real well being is not creating an ignored difficult emotions. It's created by acknowledging them, understanding them, and responding to them with empathy, honesty, and support. And whether we are a part of a school, a workplace, NGO, community initiative, or simply someone's support system, we all have a role to play in creating space where people feel safe and human. Nitin Shah sir, thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you for hosting this session again. Thank you to everyone who is listening to us, watching us right now. If there's one thought that I would like to leave all of you with, is this: the next time when someone shares a difficult experience, try listening before fixing. Understanding before advising and curiosity before judgment are extremely important. Small shifts in how we respond can create meaningful changes in how people experience support. Together, through awareness, education, collaboration, and stronger support, we can create environments and systems where both honesty and hope have a place. This has been a good starting place for us for this particular series.
This has been an interesting episode of Beyond the Narrative, where mental health myths, trends, and truths collide. Join us in the next episode as we unpack another debated idea shaping today's mental health conversations. Until then, thank you for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this conversation. And if you know of someone who's struggling with toxic positivity, do tag them, share with them this video so that they can understand what may be going wrong. If there are people around you that you feel are constantly trying to fix the problems that are there in your life rather than understanding you, listening to you, talking to you, maybe it's time for you to also share this video with them. I look forward to having more such conversations, Kiran. Thank you.